Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
From preschool on, we go to school to learn things. Yet one thing we may not be taught is how to learn. How much better could we be at everything if we just learn how to learn? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on X-Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. With us this hour to delve into the secrets of learning is Scott Young. Scott is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author of Ultralearning. He writes about learning, productivity, and self-improvement. His website, scotthyoung.com. Scott, thanks so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Thank you for having me.
Scott, what's your educational background?
Yeah, so I have an interesting one. I studied business in school, but then when I was done my business degree, I did this project I called the MIT Challenge, learning MIT's computer science curriculum online using their resources. And this sort of thrust me into the online world of talking about efficient studying tips, and basically my entire career has been delving into this research and trying to make it publicly available.
Learning it seems pretty straightforward, but apparently it's not.
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated thing. Like, what we're doing in our brains to learn things is fascinating. I think that's what drives my interest in it. It's just that it's, such an important part of what we do as human beings.
There's a lot of different learning styles, isn't there?
Well, I think there are lots of different approaches to learning. So there's lots of different ways that we can go about it, and some of them work better than others. And, that's a lot of what I spend my time on, is trying to figure out which ones we should be focusing on.
But isn't each individual wired a little different so that it's not a cookie cutter kind of issue? You have to
Yeah.
customize it to yourself a certain amount.
I do think so. I do think there is a certain amount that we need to tailor our learning experiences to our own individual abilities and our own strengths and weaknesses. Certainly if you are learning a new language, for instance, and you are a really extroverted person, you might benefit from going out and having conversations with people and immersing yourself from day one. But if you're a more introverted person, maybe you're going to make more benefit from, listening to radio shows or watching television programmings, and spending more time building up that listening ability before you go out and speak. So I do think there's some modifications we have to make, but there's also a lot of really universal principles that apply just because we have a similar way of thinking and how our brains work.
So with what you've been studying, how does what you are offering differ from what we're taught in school?
Well, I just think we don't get that much coverage of how learning works in general in school. I mean, most of us have gone through our entire school education and no one sat us down and like, this is the right way to study, and this is what research shows is more effective than this. We just don't have these classes. So it's not that there's necessarily, some secret. It's just that, we have classes in social studies, we have classes in history, we have classes in, mathematics, but we don't have classes in cognitive science. We don't have classes in how to learn, at least not in the, elementary and secondary level. I mean, if you study that as a specialty in university, maybe you'll get some of this information, but for the most part, we don't. And so I think it is a real lacuna in our understanding of ourselves.
If you could create a perfect learning environment, how young would you
Yeah.
start teaching children about learning?
Well, I think some of the things probably require a little bit of self-regulation. So I think we generally, when we're giving students assignments and we're teaching them in a classroom, we're often teaching them very deliberately. Okay, do this from a young age. It's mostly when you're getting into middle school, high school, that you start assigning homework. You start saying, okay, I'm going to just give you this, and then you have to find the best way to do it. And then when you get into university or higher, very often there's very little guidance. You have lots of different ways you could study it. So I think a lot of people get really tuned on to this efficient studying when they kind of make that leap outside of the very curated environment of the early school experience. And so they're, in medical school and they're like, oh, how can I keep up with all this information? How can I possibly keep this in my head? And then that's when they discover things like spacing and retrieval and all these sort of concepts that we aren't teaching in school, but they are important. So I think the more you have to be in charge of your own learning process, the more important it is.
So, what you study is, as I'm understanding you,
Mhm.
based on how the mind works.
Yeah, I mean, I draw a lot of inspiration from cognitive science. So this is a sort of a broad field, includes psychology, economics, anthropology, but it's basically an understanding of trying to figure out what is the brain doing, how does it learn, how do things work. And there's a lot of things that we don't know, obviously, but there's also some regularities that have emerged. There's some things that, we have research going back, maybe let's say 100 years, that shows that, for instance, when we are remembering things, it tends to fall off on this forgetting curve. I mean, Hermann Ebbinghaus, he was one of the first scientific psychologists, and he did this experiment showing memorizing things and found out, well, you tend to forget things fairly steeply at first, and then it kind of trails off in the long run. And so this is an important thing to have. And another implication of this is that if you spread out when you learn things, you retain it better with the same amount of studying effort. So that's just one principle that we can derive from this kind of scientific study to learn more effectively.
In other words, jamming for finals doesn't work so well.
Well, it works really well for that short period right after you cram for the final, but then you forget everything, which is another common experience people have. But I mean, this is something that, even beyond just the experience of cramming, people make mistakes about this. They think that they'll learn something more better if they sort of really like study it in this very intense way over this short period of time. But very often, if you do actual tests, they have better memory much longer if you kind of spread it out so that you're having a little bit each day and you're alternating so that you get to cover the same information, not all in one burst but spread out.
Does changing subjects help?
It can help. So there's also research showing about how if you alternate between what you're studying, you can improve your ability to remember things. A lot of the research is on like comparing things within the same subject. So if you were like studying a math class, there's stuff from unit 1 and unit 2. Usually you do all the homework for unit 1, then you forget about that, you wait till the final, and then you do unit 2 and do all the unit 2 questions. And this tends to be not that efficient. You'll actually learn and retain more if you are mixing the questions so that you don't know whether it's coming from unit 1 or unit 2. And I mean, this is a fairly, talking about it in this sort of very bloodless way, but generally when we learn things, the broader and more varied our experiences when we're practicing tends to result in more robust skills and deeper learning.
So, in other words, if we approach it from lots of different angles rather than just one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I think when we learn things in real life, that when we build real skills that are just sort of outside of academics, that's very important. If to use the language learning example again, if you learn a phrase and you only learn in this one setting, it's very hard to use it flexibly in lots of different situations. Whereas if you use it when, you go to the restaurant, when you go to the grocery store, when you're asking for directions, when you use it in these different contexts, you get a better sense of the full scope of the meaning, you retain it better. So this variability is very important, I think, for learning and learning efficiently.
There's a certain, as we're growing up, I assume that our learning style and our learning needs change as we're
Mhm.
maturing. Once we're mature, does it continue to change as we age?
Yeah, I mean, there's some research for sure that shows there's different patterns of our cognitive abilities over time. So children kind of are developing cognitive abilities, and some of those don't even peak until you're in your early 20s. Let's say I know a lot of stuff about self-regulation. That's the ability to like have self-control. Doesn't actually peak until you're out of high school, which probably explains a lot of high schoolers' behavior. But then also as we get older, our patterns of cognitive abilities change too. So fluid intelligence, this sort of ability to just solve completely new problems and just think quickly, I guess is a one way of putting it, tends to decline faster than what's called crystallized knowledge, which is all the accumulated experience that you've built up over a lifetime. And so you see that in some professions, like for instance, mathematicians or physicists tend to be younger when they make their prime accomplishments, but historians tend to be older because history relies on having a huge breadth of knowledge about a domain, whereas proving some esoteric math theorem is usually something that requires more raw brain power and less worldly wisdom.
Can we, are there exercises or things that you recommend that we can do to maintain our ability to do the um, quick decisions, the quicker
Yeah.
learning?
Well, one of the things that we can do is if we practice skills, we actually increase our ability to do things within that domain. And this sounds like the best way I can put it is think about some skill that you've practiced a lot. A good example would be reading. If you start reading and you've never read before, it's actually kind of miraculous that we can do this. Like there's little black squiggles on the page and we can just look at them and almost instantly hear words in our head that are the words that are on the page. But if you were starting to read it, it would be quite difficult. You'd have to recognize each letter and then what sound does that make and then merge the letters together. It's a complicated skill. And so as you practice, the skills that you continue to practice become more efficient. They become something that requires less conscious effort. And so I think that's one of the big reasons to invest in learning and to invest in a broad set of skills. Researchers call this kind of cognitive reserve. So if you've built a lot of skills and knowledge over your lifetime, as you get older, you have this sort of buffer zone that keeps you from experiencing sort of noticeable declines to your performance. So people who had active lives where they were learning a lot, learned a lot of skills, learned lots of these things, when they get older, they tend to do better because even if there is some reduction in some part of your brain volume or your neural efficiency, you have these other things that can compensate for it. So it doesn't manifest itself in a way that, maybe requires that you need help when you're older, that kind of thing.
Well, we're just about out of time in this segment, but when we come back, I'd like to get into that. Okay, how can we maintain our cognitive ability as we age? It seems like a pretty important topic at this time in our lives. So, Scott and I will return very shortly. So, don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org.
Welcome to Haunted Indian River County by Larry Lawson. Indian River County is an idyllic vacation spot on Florida's east coast, not far south of Cape Canaveral. Known as part of the state's famed Treasure Coast, many are unaware of the deep and fascinating history this area played in the development of the Sunshine State. Also lost among its visitors and residents are the chilling stories of the hauntings that accompany this rich history. It is here that a man named Waldo still looks after his family and properties 6 decades after his death. Or a retired preacher is seen digging up his hidden treasure days after he died. Larry Lawson spent more than 40 years in the law enforcement and criminal justice education profession. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Nova Southeastern University and a master's degree in public administration from Troy State University. He serves on the board of directors of the Indian River County Historical Society, is the director of the Florida Bureau of Paranormal Investigation, and is the owner of Indian River Hauntings, LLC, where he provides historical and paranormal tours and events. He has been actively researching the history and paranormal legends of the Treasure Coast of Florida since 2010. Larry is currently the host of Paranormal Stakeout radio TV show on the X-Zone Broadcast Network and the past host of Encounters with the Other Side on WPSL Radio in Fort Pierce, Florida. Pre-order your copy of Haunted Indian River County by Larry Lawson on Amazon.com today.
Do you know how to learn? With us discussing the art of learning is the author of Get Better at Anything, Scott Young. Scott, what are some of the greatest myths about learning? I mean, we all have an idea about learning, but what are some of the greatest myths?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots. There's lots of things that we've discovered through scientific research that, like, they seem like intuitive ideas, but they probably aren't true. So, one of the ones that I think is important is that we tend to have this idea that the mind is like a muscle. So that if we are strengthening it, it's a little bit like, if you were to lift a bunch of weights with your arms, you get stronger biceps, and then that would help you in anything that you need to use your biceps for. So you're carrying luggage, you're lifting groceries, that kind of thing. And it seems that that kind of metaphor that, okay, we're just going to do some sort of generic mind strengthening activity should be true for the brain as well. But there's a lot of evidence against this, that it doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm somewhat pessimistic about, let's say, brain training, or doing some particular activity, let's say like Sudoku puzzles, to improve your reasoning. Probably it's the case that a better metaphor for the mind is that it's a collection of tools built out of knowledge. So this is the idea that if you want to have broad mental abilities, you want to be smarter, you want to think and learn better, what you need to do is actually learn a lot of different things and learn them and practice them in different contexts. And so in this sense, the kind of idea of filling up your sort of mental library is probably a better metaphor for how the mind works. That's one of them, but I think there's lots that we encounter in research where we have mistaken ideas about what's the right way to learn.
When we're collecting data, if you will,
Mhm.
um, what happens? I mean, we learn something, and at first it's in short-term memory, right?
Yeah.
And then when it goes to long-term, is it easier or more difficult to access? What are the tools there?
Yeah. So the basic way the brain works in terms of learning memory is that there is a short-term memory or working memory, which is basically what we're thinking about right now. So what you're kind of consciously aware of is your working memory. And then there's long-term memory, which is essentially this repository of every experience that you've ever had. And the difficulty we have is that the short-term memory or working memory is very small. So we can only really think of a couple things at a time. And this makes it very difficult. If I were to, give you a phone number and I said 7 numbers, well, maybe you can remember it without having to like write it down first. But if I told you 20, almost nobody could remember it. So it is quite a short window of what we can remember. But the amount of things that we can retain in our lifetime is vast. We can remember tons and tons of things. The difficulty is not only getting it into memory, so making sure that when we hear the phone number, it doesn't go just in one ear and out the other, but then also how do we get it out at the right time? And so I think a lot of learning is that it's about how do you properly attend to things so that you'll actually remember them. And then when you're in a situation where you need knowledge, how do you recall the right phone number? How do you recall the right piece of information? And so
Is
that is really the art of learning.
Sorry. Is there an associative a tool there where you associate things? I know sometimes
Yeah.
when I'm trying to remember a name, I'll try to find something to, another person
Right.
I've known with that name or whatever. Otherwise, I have a terrible time with it.
Well, mnemonics, I think, is what you're referencing here. This is a technique that goes back to the ancient Greeks, and basically the idea is that we're bad at associating arbitrary things. So we're bad at like associating a name, which is just sort of a sound or words, to a person's face or what they look like. This is not an obvious association; it's arbitrary. So what we can do is if we can bridge it with some sort of association that makes sense, that's easier to remember, then we often have a better time. So if I, want to remember Gwilda, for instance, and I can think of like Gwendolyn, and maybe Gwendolyn, I'm thinking of, from King Arthur, and she has red hair. That's maybe how I'm going to associate it. And I'll remember that gwa sound, and that will remember your name when I encounter you again. And so these are little techniques. Now, mnemonics are a strategy that are particularly useful if you have to memorize a lot of things. There's even international competitions for people who can memorize, let's say, the order of a deck of cards. And if you really practice these techniques, you can do it in like under a minute or something. It's incredible. But the brain also works through just repetition as well. So if I interacted with you and I kept, I used your name, I used it in a conversation with another person. Oh, I had a conversation with Will the other day. That would form a direct association. So I would not need to go through this sort of elaborate King Arthurian tale to remember what your name is. It would just show up automatically. And so what makes sense for learning, I think it depends on the context. But in a lot of contexts, you don't even need to use mnemonics. If you just have enough practice where you associate those two things, you just sort of, like the flashcard, you see the one side and then you flip to see the other side. You'll make a direct connection between those things as well. So that's another strategy for doing things. And particularly if you have to remember a lot of information, it can be an effective one.
You mentioned that doing things in order to learn them well, doing things in different circumstances, in different environments
Yeah.
helps. Do we actually store some of our memories in the environment?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a whole hypothesis that we our thinking is extended, meaning that it's not just something that takes place in our brain, but it takes place in the environment. So if I'm skiing down a mountain, for instance, it's not like I have some mental simulation of me going down the mountain in my head, and then I make some calculations on that, and that's how I'm deciding to move my muscles. It's probably more like as the snow pushes against my legs, it creates this sort of movement in my muscles, and I automatically make some kind of response. So in this sense, you can't learn to ski if you're not on the mountain, right? Because it's not like you have some video game simulation of skiing in your head. You have to interact with the environment. And so this is true of a lot of skills. And I think this is also even more true if we add in all the technology that we have now. If you're thinking about doing mathematics and you are doing sort of long calculations, yes, you probably learned how to do long division by hand. But if you're like most people, you whip out a calculator and you do it on there because it's much faster. And so as we get more technologically capable, this sort of dialogue of thinking doesn't just take place in your head. It takes place also in computers. It takes place on paper. Takes place in the minds of other people as well.
One of the things I learned, I was a dog trainer for a while. One of the things I learned is that they learn very differently than we do, and they recall very differently than we do. So I
Mm.
could take a dog and try to teach him things in a new environment, and he'd take him a little while. But I could take a hunting dog out to a terrain that he hasn't seen since he was a pup, and he would instantaneously know where everything was, where the game was, et cetera, et cetera. Humans don't do it quite like that. What have you studied the difference there?
Well, I don't know about spatial reasoning in canines versus humans, but I do know that there is research showing that like human beings, the way we think, we tend to think of ourselves just being like superior than animals on all regards. But there are actually some situations where animals can do better than people. I mean, there's this. I'm trying to remember the exact source, but there was this chimpanzee that was trained to do this sort of number game. Basically, like a screen would show, it would blink on for like half a second, and it would have the numbers like 1 through 10 on there, and it had to press them in order. Now, it took a lot of training for the animal to do this, so it wasn't like the chimp just did this automatically. But what was crazy is that if you watch this chimp do it, it's like blinks and then it goes da 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 da, and it seems to suggest that the chimp has a better kind of what you could call like eidetic or photographic memory than we do. It is better able to retain what that image was and do it than a person could in that situation. And there's other evidence showing that crows, for instance, are able to solve this puzzle where you put food in a bottle and you give them a piece of metal and they turn it into a hook and then use that to get the food out of the bottle. And young children, so like sort of, I think that this children's study were like 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds, are much worse than the crows at figuring this out. They can't actually do it. But what we are good at doing is that the children are very good at being shown how to solve something. And so this is actually an interesting insight that what we seem to be good at is observing other people and learning the solutions that they use. And that maybe is part of the explanation for why human beings are so dominant against all the other species, is that we have culture. We have the ability to learn from other people, whereas most animals lack this ability. So in some ways, the expression monkey see, monkey do has it backwards, that it's humans see and do, and monkeys can only do. They can't see and learn from observation.
Interesting. So we spoke that some people learn in different ways. How can you figure out what's your style in order to customize a learning program for yourself?
Right. Well, one thing I would push back on a little bit is that a lot of the research on learning style, so this is like kinesthetic, auditory, visual, has
Mhm.
come up negative. So this is a very popular idea, but a lot of the careful research has found that if, let's say, you have a lecture and it's we're going to be teaching geography, let's say, and you give some people the information in a visual format and some people in auditory format, and you compare the people who self-select as visual learners or auditory learners and see if they perform better when the information matches their modality. This tends to not be the case. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no differences in people. There's certainly differences in background knowledge. I wouldn't explain quantum mechanics to a seasoned physicist the same way I would to a 5-year-old. And that's just sort of an obvious difference. So if you come to a skill, if you come to a learning, you have different prior experiences. If you already play squash, then learning tennis is going to be different for you than it would be for someone who's never played a racket sport before. So that's a very big difference. Another difference is that we have different strengths and abilities. So again, as I mentioned, when we're learning a language, if you're an extroverted person, maybe it's not such a big deal for you to like have these conversations, go to a language meetup meet up and talk in a language you're just starting to learn with strangers. Whereas if that's terrifying for you, if that sounds like really unpleasant, then maybe that's not the right way to approach it. So I tend to think more in terms of what are our background knowledge? What are the other skills that we have that maybe help us or maybe hinder us too? If you've learned to type on a QWERTY keyboard, which is the normal keyboard layout, and you're a good touch typer, that would actually probably hurt you if you were trying to learn on one of the different keyboards where they move the keys around. If you go to France, for instance, they have the letters in a different place, then it can be quite hard because you are learning a different skill. So I think the background knowledge we bring to things is probably the primary factor in how we should adjust how we learn.
So, of course, everybody's background knowledge is a little different based on their
Mm-hmm.
family of origin, their
Right.
schools, their society.
Mm-hmm.
And I did notice this traveling is people learn different in different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah. So well, it's about that time to take another station break. But Scott and I will be back to continue this discussion. So you stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org, and we're coming to you through the X Zone Broadcast Network. Do you have a product or service you'd like to promote to a worldwide audience? Imagine your product featured on Mission Evolution Radio TV. If you're interested in showcasing your work, Mission Evolution is broadcast to the X Zone TV Channel 32 Simul TV, on the X Zone Broadcast Network, YouTube, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Audible, and many other audio and social media platforms. Our professional studios can produce and broadcast your custom high-quality ad. It will be permanently embedded in each episode and featured in the archives for years to come. Together, we can make it happen. Contact us at info@missionevolution.org for more details. Spaces are limited, so don't miss out on this great opportunity. Email info@missionevolution.org today. Can you indeed teach an old dog new tricks? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing improving ourselves through continued learning is Scott Young. His website is scottHyoung.com. Scott, what does aging, how does it help or impede our learning styles?
Yeah, so I think the way we learn changes as we age, and we mentioned this before the break, that if you're talking about intelligence, researchers tend to clump it into two different types: fluid intelligence, which is sort of your kind of raw processing ability, and crystallized intelligence, which represents all of the smarts that you've obtained through your years of experience and wisdom in the world. And one of the things that we know is that the older you are, typically you gain some crystallized intelligence because you are learning more things. Now, it depends, I think, on your exact background. Obviously, if you never touch a book, you never learn anything new for 50 years, you're probably not gaining as much in your crystallized intelligence. But people can continue to build experience and proficiency over a lifetime with this sort of built-in knowledge. And this is one of the reasons why, as we mentioned, historians tend to peak later in their careers, because it just takes so long to get that background of experience when you are trying to make some sort of historical analysis. And I think that one of the things that we can do as we get older is rely more on this crystallized knowledge. So switch sort of to, when you're younger, focusing on learning some of those really difficult skills that require a lot of working memory, a lot of fluid intelligence. So I think when you're younger is a good time to focus on making sure you study your math, making sure you study some of these subjects. But as you get older, building that broader experience, I think, is something you can continue to do throughout your life, and build on those sort of initial building blocks that you had in your early education.
So as a person gets older and gets more of your what you call crystallized, um, I feel pretty crystallized sometimes. Um, can they become quicker at problem solving and everything because they have more resources?
Well, definitely. I mean, the quickest way to solve a problem is to already know the answer. And so much of what we do in our lives is turn problems, things that are, genuinely you have to think to, into routines, into things that we know how to solve. And I think we sometimes take for granted how many things in our life were problems that are now routines. I brought up the example of learning to read as one, which most of us have mastered this skill. And so we don't even think about all the stuff that has to go on in order for us to do it successfully. But even just to use a more anodyne example, like how do you use a washing machine? I mean, this is probably something that was a puzzle for someone at some point of like which clothes go together and how do you put the soap and this kind of thing, which if you've had a lot of life experience, obviously you don't even think about it. So I think that's one of the main ways that we get better at solving problems is by accumulating not just okay, this is exactly how this works, but general principles, general methods, general ideas about how different domains work. And that I think is part of the learning process. And that's why to keep investing in learning, because that larger that toolkit is in your head, the more you can tackle new situations and not get stymied by them.
Can you purposefully build
Yeah.
efficient subroutines um, that then become cemented so that you don't have to think about it and make you more proficient and give you more operating room for doing other
Yeah.
things at the same time?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is sort of how our brain works. So, to use the example, if you're driving a car, for instance, when you start driving a car, everything is very deliberate. You have to use this. We were talking about the working memory, the short term memory, this little tiny span of consciousness on every single detail. Okay, how do I turn the signal on? How do I move the steering wheel? Which pedal is gas? Which one is brake? Don't mix those up. These are all things that you have to think about when you're driving, when you are, 16 or when you're starting to drive. That if you've been driving for a lifetime, now you're listening to maybe you're even listening to this show right now and you're like, oh, you're so lost in thought that you miss your exit because you're used to going on your commute and you just automatically go to your destination. So this is what we do when we're learning. As we practice, as we get more experience with something, your brain is automatically turning those situations into little routines so that you don't have to think about it. You make it more efficient, more automatic. And so this is, again, going back to this idea of why we want to work on skills and practice them, is because as you do them more, they become more efficient. They require less mental effort. And that's true across the lifespan. So yes, it is the case that, if you have, maybe you're not as sharp as you were when you were 21, but if you continue to practice, it's much better to be an experienced 65-year-old than it is to be an inexperienced 21-year-old for almost all skills.
Well, that's good to know. Not obsolete yet, right? Um, so, what happens when you've built a nice subroutine and you're good and
Yeah.
comfortable with it and it's in the files,
Yeah.
and then things change so that subroutine is no longer desirable? Can you
Mhm.
dismantle it? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, this problem you're talking about of unlearning, this is a real big one in a lot of skills. So, if you're learning to type, for instance, a lot of us, maybe if you never went to a typing class, you do this sort of one or two finger hunting and pecking on the keyboard. And the difficulty is that, yes, you can make that more and more automatic. So you'll get better and better at it. You'll do the hunting and pecking even faster and you'll find the keys and you'll spend less time doing it. But continuing to practice is not necessarily going to evolve that into the full hand touch typing that you would learn in a typing school. And so it can be the case that lots of experience sort of entrenches a way of doing things rather than makes it better or more automatic. And so one of the things that we have to do as we are learning things is also recognize when maybe what we're doing isn't as efficient. So there was this researcher, he passed away a couple of years ago, K. Anders Ericsson, and he had this whole theory of deliberate practice, this idea that it's not just doing something repeatedly, but doing it with a specific intention to aim at a particular goal, aim at a particular process, aim at sort of like, okay, I'm a concert violinist and I'm going to work on that tricky section and make sure I get the vibrato just right in this one note. That is a key performance, because what you're doing is you're trying to override what is become an automatic skill, what has become something that you've just done to the point where you don't even think about it anymore. So in some ways, going back to being a beginner again is often what you need to do to make improvements on skills that you have practiced for a lot of time, that you've practiced throughout the lifetime.
So, you basically have to dismantle those neurological pathways to make room for a new way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the case that you're not dismantling the old way, but you're building a new way that kind of outcompetes the old way. So it is probably the case that, if you did learn to hunt and peck, you never forget that, but maybe you learn the other way and then it can override it. And that can be an issue because if you're in a stressful situation, sometimes, people who are in athletics, if they learn a new movement for their sport and then they're in a stressful situation, their old bad way of doing it kind of like comes up in a competition because the stress causes you to like forget your new training and go back to the way that feels more familiar.
So you kind of like stuck on a track and can't get off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it is probably the case that you need a lot of practice to overcome a really well learned skill. Yeah.
There's a form of learning that a lot of martial arts use. It's called circular learning.
Mm,
And that's when you go to the point of failure, but instead of going back to the point of failure and correcting and going on, you go clear to the beginning of the routine.
mm.
Are you familiar with that, and what are the benefits?
Well, I don't know about the circular learning idea that you talked about specifically, but there is a lot of research on if you're learning, let's say, a complicated skill. So if you're learning a skill that has a lot of different points in sequence, one of the ways that if you want to learn that skill really well is to actually do it backwards. So you start with the end part, you practice that, and then you keep kind of adding in the beginning. And this actually works better than going forward, which is so, sometimes if you're like learning to say a phrase in another language and it's too long, like you can't just remember it in your head and repeat it, the correct way, start with the end of the word and then say it a few times and then keep adding up to the beginning. And this backward chaining technique actually works better than going the other way. So I don't know whether that's the same as circular learning, but it made me think of it.
I think it's similar. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's similar. And it's an old concept that we don't use much in this culture, but I have found it to be pretty interesting when it is
Yeah.
employed. Um, so, what role does curiosity play in learning?
I mean, curiosity is everything, right? Like it's the motivation to learn. And honestly, we're talking about a lot of the cognitive sciences, this almost sort of mechanical principles of spacing and retrieval. And I'm just talking about backwards chaining. But the real thing is like, what motivates you to do those things? What motivates you to want to be better, to want to know more, to want to build this toolkit? And so I think curiosity is a very powerful emotion. And one of the things that I think is very important to realize about curiosity is that it is not like other drives. So hunger is a kind of stabilizing drive that when you're hungry, you eat some food and then you're less hungry. But curiosity almost works the opposite way, that the more you know about something, the more curious you are about it. It's the people who don't know anything about a subject that are the least curious, because to actually formulate questions, to have mysteries, to have things that you want to seek out, you need knowledge in order to be able to do that. And so in some ways, learning is this flywheel that if you invest in, it keeps accelerating, because as you learn more, you become more interested in the things that you already know a little bit about. And so, if you ask anyone who's a sports fan, for instance, they're probably more curious about sports than someone who doesn't follow the games, because they know which questions to ask. They know which things are interesting or confusing or something that's surprising for them.
So, is curiosity related to imagination at all?
Well, I think they're probably related. I would define curiosity as like the desire to know something. And certainly imagination, it helps in formulating those questions. It helps you think about things. And I think there's a certain, kind of broad umbrella of just like creativity, imagination, just that there are people who are able to think of things in unusual ways, unusual associations that I think can drive research. I know Albert Einstein, he was someone who was particularly imaginative thinker, that he's sort of famous for E equals MC squared, but he wasn't actually that good at the math. He actually struggled with the math quite a bit. What he was really good at was these sort of intuitive thought experiments of like, what would be the consequences of going at the speed of light, for instance. And that was how he made his scientific breakthroughs. So imagination and curiosity are very powerful.
And pretty closely related, it sounds like.
Mhm.
Mhm. So, we're again about to go into a station break, but I would like to discuss what's the difference between, say, Albert Einstein and your average bloke, and how can we accelerate our ability to be creative? Please stay with
Well,
us as Scott and I continue to explore getting better at everything. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org.
Are you ready for a tale that will leave you on the edge of your seat? Get ready to dive into the gripping memoir by Bart Sibrel titled Moon Man. Bart Sibrel takes you on a heart-pounding journey, unmasking the truth behind America's famous Apollo missions. Prepare yourself for hair-raising encounters with agents from the U.S. government's top secret agencies. In Moonman, Sibrel fearlessly reveals his real-life espionage adventures, shining a light on one of the CIA's best-kept secrets. Brace yourself for shocking revelations, including Sibrel's discovery of privately recorded audio exposing an Apollo astronaut's chilling plot, a plot orchestrated by the CIA. That's right. As Sibrel unveils this groundbreaking evidence, it becomes clear that there is much more to the Apollo missions than meets the eye. Could it be that we've been deceived all along? Moonman is a gripping page-turner that challenges everything you thought you knew. It's a mind-bending journey into the unknown, where the line between truth and fiction becomes blurred. Don't miss this opportunity to uncover the secrets hidden for decades. Let your curiosity guide you as you join Bart Sibrel on his quest to find the truth. Moonman, available now at Sibrel.com. That's Sibrel.com. Prepare to have your beliefs shaken to the very core.
What happens when we stop learning? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Scott Young. His website, scotthyoung.com. Scott, we were discussing before we went into the break how Einstein had a very unique style of thinking and learning
Mhm.
and becoming curious and then following that into new information. And this is something that's interested me for a long time because if we have to learn everything from somebody else, learning becomes finite, doesn't it?
Mhm.
We need the creative thinkers to blaze new trails, if you will. So, how can we become more creative in our learning?
Yeah, so you mentioned Einstein and what were some of his key attributes. And I think one of the things that we tend to associate with people like that is that it's mostly mathematics, right? That someone who is going to come up with these theories, they have mastered the computation. But as I mentioned, Einstein was sort of famously not that good at the math. He really struggled with it and he needed help on some of the parts of general relativity, which uses some very complicated math. But what he was really good at was the thought experiments and the ability to sort of work out the intuitive consequences of things. And so I think that is something that you can probably get better at with training, is that if you work on sort of imagining things, there's some experiments showing that if you do practice with, let's say, there's experiments where you like unfold a dice cube, for instance, and figure out, okay, if you fold it back together, will it look like this? And this is something that some people can do right away. They have a better spatial memory. They have a better ability to just sort of manipulate this sort of thing in their mind's eye and then decide whether it fits. And other people require some help to do it. But if you practice it and you work on it, you can get better at this task. So I think practicing imagining things, practicing working through the consequences, things, working on these skills will probably help you with your spatial imaginative abilities. And so I think people who have a lifetime as a career in, in Hollywood, in storytelling, in visual arts and this kind of thing, yes, they probably have some natural ability that made them go into that in the first place. But through that extensive practice, they're better able to make use of that limited resources in their brain so that they can, manipulate things and imagine new possibilities.
It seems a lot more proficient to imagine things and dream them till they're in to see what the
Mhm.
outcome is rather than going for it in the material world
Yeah.
and coming up against a brick wall.
Yeah, I mean, there's this old anecdote. It's probably apocryphal, but of Nikola Tesla, the Serbian engineer, who he went through and when he was trying to figure out how a machine was broken, he would like mentally simulate all of the gears until he's like, "Oh, it's this one that's not hooked up right." I mean, most of us probably can't do that, but I do think if we practice thinking in that way with particular problems, just the same way that if you practice reading, you get better at decoding the words and letters, you probably get better at the specific operations that are involved in that kind of imagination. I don't want to oversell it. I don't want to say the case that we could become Albert Einstein if we just imagine really hard, but I think solving problems mentally and solving problems to work through these things, you probably develop some, what you were saying, your words, these subroutines for making our memory more efficient.
So, There's an interesting topic you brought up. It's the long-term improvement of Tetris players.
Oh yeah.
What's it show us about improving our skills?
Yeah, so this is kind of a fun story. First heard about this from the YouTuber John Green, but basically, Tetris was a game that was phenomenally popular. It came out in the late 80s, early 90s, depending on when you count it. And people were obsessed with it even then. There's, op-eds being written about people are hallucinating falling blocks, and they're playing this game obsessively. But if you look at the top performance, so there was actually people keeping track of the best Tetris players in the world. They aren't that good. The players today are much, much better. And there's 12 and 13-year-olds now that are like leagues beyond anything people could do back then in the 90s. And so the question is why? Why is it the case that people are much better at this now than they were then? And the explanation that John Green posited, which I agree with, is that what happened is that in the early 90s, the way you could learn was essentially limited to what you could discover on your own through just playing it, or through maybe a friend or a friend of a friend. They knew some trick, and then, okay, you can do this to do this in the game, and you can learn it. Whereas now we have the internet. We have live streaming. We have video showing someone's hand that they're moving through playing the controller. And it turns out that's really important. Like the right way to hold the camera, the controller right now is kids these days they have like a glove on so they can like tap it in a certain way so you can hit the button a certain amount of times. It's really stuff you would never figure out on your own. And so learning through observation, learning what we were saying, this ability to see how other people are doing it and adopt those techniques is what is making people better. And this was I think, not just an idea that applies to Tetris, but it applies in many, many situations. And it's part of what resulted in the development of science. Before science, there was a lot more trial and error. There was a lot more difficulty communicating, okay, this is some facts we've learned about the world. And so I think the idea here and the lesson to draw from the Tetris players is that the more you can have an environment where knowledge is shared freely and we can learn from each other, the more we'll be able to accelerate innovation.
I'm going to throw you a curveball here.
Yeah.
There's the 100th monkey theory. Also, there's knowledge base or cultural base, they call it. And like the automobile wasn't invented, and then once it was invented, a bunch of people came up with it independently
Yeah.
at the same time. How does
Yeah.
that play in here?
Yeah. So one way of thinking about this is that all technology, all problems that we solve are kind of like moving through a sort of maze-like space. There's different moves you can make if you can move left or right, except the left and right are, okay, well, you hook up the engine this way, or you try this design, or you do this. So it's a little bit more complicated than a maze, but we're moving out in this space. And so in some sense, technologies are just ripe once we have the prerequisites. So in order to have the automobile, you have to have certainly the combustion engine. This is why you didn't have it back in Roman times, because we needed to invent the combustion engine. And you also need to have a lot of other little technical things. Like you probably need to have the right kind of alloys for steel and rubber for the tires. I remember a discussion of the invention of the bicycle, and we had a lot of the parts for making bicycles, but they weren't quite good enough yet. They weren't quite good enough yet for making that as a product. But once they were all good enough, then it was really, you just had to put a few new ideas together to create the bicycle. And so a lot of people did it at the same time. So multiple invention, the idea of many people discovering an idea at the same time, is common throughout history, especially in science and technology, where they're really, the ingredients have to be ripe, but once they are ripe, a lot of people can do it. And so this also shows that a lot of what we think of as creativity as like a totally new invention, a totally new idea, is really just like the final part of putting together a few ideas on this base of knowledge and experience and existing technology that we already have. So to quote Isaac Newton, we see further by standing on the shoulders of giants, but really we're the little bump on top of a large mountain of knowledge and technique that has come before us.
Well, Scott, it's that time in the show, and I get to ask you, what's your mission?
Well, my mission is to understand how learning works, to learn better, not only for myself, but for other people. I have 2 kids now, and I really care about educating them as well. And so learning, I think, is one of the most important things that we do as a species. And so understanding that is my mission in life.
A very worthwhile one. And I'm glad you're sharing it with all of us. It's
Thank
so
you.
important. And so, we spend our whole life doing it, and yet we never learn how. That's mind-boggling to me. So, how can we get better at everything?
Well, I think the basic idea of getting better at anything is that we want to learn the best techniques. So learn from other people, like we were talking about with the Tetris players. We want to do practice. The right kind of practice is important. We talked about a few of those ideas. Spacing matters, doing the deliberate practice, but aiming our efforts so that we're doing the right kind of thing. And then we also want to get feedback. We want to get feedback from the environment, like the skier going down the mountain, feeling the mountain beneath his feet, and also feedback from other people, feedback on the right way to do things, feedback on what our strengths and weaknesses are. And so I think if we can get those three ingredients right, we will be able to improve in a lot of domains.
And what's your um, why do we get stuck? Why do we get stuck when we're trying to get better? I mean, sometimes we're starting to improve, and then all of a sudden we just kind of hit up
Yeah.
against a brick wall. What's happening there?
I mean, I think there's lots of ways that we can get stuck. So one of the ways that we get stuck is if we don't know what the right way to do something is. So I was using the example of the Tetris players, that there are certain ways that you can, move things around that are much better than other ways. And it's very difficult to discover those by trial and error. So that's the first place that we get stuck, is that we don't know what the right way to do something is. And I think this is particularly important, in, let's say, our professional lives, because a lot of this knowledge isn't taught in school. I'm sure the person who's listening to this can reflect on all the things they had to learn on the job that weren't taught in the classroom that make a big difference for being able to do your work well. And so being able to learn from other people is very important. Another reason we can get stuck is, as I said, when you practice something repeatedly, you tend to make it more automatic. You tend to make it more efficient, requires less effort, but there's only a certain amount that you can change the fundamental skill. So if we're practicing hunting and pecking on the keyboard, that's never going to turn into touch typing. And so if we are practicing a lot with the hunting and pecking and you're trying to be an efficient touch typer, you're probably not going to go there. So practicing the right way is super important too. And then of course, getting feedback is important. If you are not able to get feedback in a pursuit, you can spend decades doing it and become very, very confident, but not actually that skilled. So there's lots of evidence that people in professions like hiring managers, stock pickers, lots of these situations, you can get a lot of confidence in your ability, but if you actually analyze performance, people are not that good, or they're not that much better than relatively simple ways of making these decisions.
Well, it sounds complicated and at the same time fairly simple. We are virtually out of time in the show, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Could you tell us really, really quick where we can find your book?
Yeah, so I mean, you can find my books, Get Better at Anything and Ultralearning, at Amazon, Audible, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. And you can also check out my website, scotthyoung.com. I've got links to the books, but also lots of free essays where we dive into the science of learning and improvement.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Our guest this hour has been Scott Young. Scott is the Wall Street Journal best-selling author of Ultralearning and Get Better at Anything. To find out more about Scott and where you can find his books, visit his website, scotthyoung.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But most importantly, please be sure to join us right here next time as this mission continues, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.